the water that we drink, the water we consume, is very, very important considering the amount of water that we store in our bodies. Right, so the water that we drink, the water we consume is very, very important. And before we get started with today's topic, let's give all the glory, all the praises, and all the honor to the Most High in the name of His only begotten Son. I just want to start off with this Bible verse in the book of John. And we're going to be starting off in chapter 4, verse 14. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. And so what Christ was saying here basically was him and his teachings, right? Everything he stands for. When you take on his spirit, he provides you with those living waters. And the analogy that I want to make here today is that, right, that type of living water is a water that we all survive off. Now, I was almost going to say that we're a human being, right? I'll try and refrain from saying human being. Us men and women created in the image of the Most High, well, we basically need H2O to survive, right? We need water to survive. Just like the fish in the water, right, at the sea. Right, we know that the Most High created the seawater. But you see, the seawater is something that we cannot consume. What happens if we drink the seawater? We will then become sick, won't we? So the H2O that we need is just that. It's pure H2O. And so the analogy that I was using here with Christ, right? He's saying that basically the water that is sprung up from a well, that water that is underneath the ground, that water is something that is pure, right? So that pure water that gets sprang forth from the ground, and we know many, many years ago, right, it was just a normal thing that, everybody in their houses, right, everybody had their own well. And what they would do is they would draw water from that well. So we know that everything that comes from the ground, that water there is pure. That's the pure water that us, that mankind has been ordained to drink, right? And we need that water to survive, right? If we don't have that water to survive, that fuel there, that fuel that we need, right, to keep going. That's why Christ was using that analogy, saying that he is the living waters that we need, right? So instead of drinking that living water in the flesh, what he simply meant was, take me on in the spirit, and I will give you everything you need. So I thought I'd use that quick analogy there just to, understand the importance of, living waters, right? And the water that they used to consume from the well, right? Which was just such a normalcy that, every single household, would have had their own source of water. Every single household would have had their own source of water to, consume from the ground, right? So back then, it was only completely normal. Now, fast forward all of these years, right? Let me ask you this question. What water are we now told that we have to consume? Right, so nowadays, a lot of, what we see here about getting water from the ground, we now somewhat have these restrictions placed upon us. Right, so the only options that we basically have are, whatever state we're living in, we have our mains water, right? And so the mains water comes from the government, right? And so not only do we have mains water, and mind you, a lot of people would be drinking mains water, because they're thinking, the water that's coming from these government facilities, well, they're putting their trust in the government, and they're saying, well, if it's coming from a government facility, then surely that has to be something that is good for us. They're taking all of the garbage out of the water. Not only that, but they are putting minerals into our water, right? And that's a good thing, right? So many people would be under that impression. And so this is your basic, what you will call tap water. A tap water that's coming from the mains comes from your government ran facility. And so another type of water we have is rainwater, right? So there would be people out there thinking, all of our rainwater that we're drinking is 100% natural. Rainwater is not something that's contaminated. Okay, so who out there has a rainwater tank at their house? Who out there drinks rainwater? Drop your comments down below. Let us know what you are drinking. So rainwater is something, basically, once again, hundreds of years ago, people would drink that rainwater, being something that is safe. Looking into the clouds, looking in the air, right, that water there, right, they weren't having to deal with chemtrails. They weren't having to deal with, these types of pollutants in the air that we are dealing with today, right? So somewhat, you would say that the rainwater they were drinking back in the day was pretty clean, right? So they would drink, if it wasn't from the, I'm pointing upwards, if it wasn't coming from the ground, right? If it wasn't coming from the well that they were drawing from, it would be coming from the sky. And so we have all these different types of drinking water, and it's very, very important, each and every method, we get our water from. Our source of water is going to define, our overall health. As crazy as that sounds, but, people out there will just think water is water. Right? If I can't see any floaties, around in there, the water would be somewhat right to drink. But I have with me today here, I have 3 glasses of water, right? And I have my TDS meter. And what a TDS meter basically does is that TDS meter, it measures the parts per million, okay, inside of the water. And I have 3 glasses here with me today. I have a mains water, okay, so water that's coming from a government funded facility. And I also have a glass of rainwater, right? So that water in the rainwater cup is coming from the rainwater tank, which is coming from the sky. And then in the third cup, I have a glass of distilled water here with me today. And distilled water is something that I drink. And distilled water is what I personally consume, right? So who out there also drinks distilled water? And the reason for this video today is answering a question basically. So this is going to be a video response to my sister Clearwater360. Now, in one of my previous videos, she basically just asked me why I drink distilled water. And so what this video is basically a follow-up to that question. So great question, Clearwater360. If anybody has any more questions, please feel free to email me over at johnnycaprice.management@mail.com. All right? I'm usually pretty slow to get back to you in the comments, so always feel free to message me on my email. And so this is the TDS meter we were talking about, right? So what this does is this measures the parts per million, right? So you drop it in the water up to here. And what that does is that basically measures the parts per million inside of the water. Now, what that means is basically the parts per million. The parts per million is how many parts, what you would call chemicals, metals, anything inside of that water that is equivalating to the mass of that water. This part per million, calculator is going to be able to pick up that part. So, you would have guessed out there surely, looking at something like distilled water. Distilled water is probably the closest that we're going to get to 0 parts per million, right? So the less contaminants inside of the water, the more cleaner that water is to drink. So keep that in mind. The less contaminants inside of the water, right, the more it's going to drop down around, 0. So typically if you're making your own distilled water, you want that to be getting as close to 0 parts per million as possible. Now, there's so many myths about what water we should be drinking. Distilled water is something, that's been completely demonized today. When we are talking about mainstream water companies, right, they say, you need to have minerals inside of your water. If you don't have minerals inside of your water, you're going to die, you're going to die. They tell you all of these myths, right? But, the Most High, let's not forget, right? The Most High created pure H2O, right? So the reason why I drink distilled water is because I'm basically getting as close to 0 parts per million as possible, meaning that H2O that I'm drinking is as pure as possible. Now, I don't worry about if I don't have magnesium, right, potassium inside of my water, right, because I take minerals separately, just like many of you out there, who also takes minerals separately, they don't have to worry about getting it from the water. But it's very interesting when we go to the mains water website, which is the government ran facilities that give us our mains water, right? When we go to their websites, all right, we can see that they're actually treating our water with minerals. They're putting magnesium in there, right? They're putting potassium in there, right? So we're having a couple of minerals that they're putting in for us, right? That must be a good thing. However, we are going to see that they are also putting toxins in our water, okay? So fluoride is a toxin. Not only that, but chlorine. Okay, so fluoride, chlorine, not to mention everything else that's been put in our water. So if anybody's done the test out there where they can grab a magnet, right, and so they put the magnet up to the glass, and basically what happens is if you trace that magnet around, right, the glass, and you have these little black specks that are following the magnet, and so we know basically that is a very good chance that we are seeing graphene there, right? So not only do we have to deal with fluoride, chlorine, all of these contaminants that are being put in our drinking water, right, then they say, okay, we need to treat the water, right, so we can give you the correct minerals, right? They're giving us magnesium, potassium, all right, but what about everything else, right? So not only do we have fluoride and chlorine in there, but we also have nanotechnology, right? So we're finding nanotech in the water, okay? So, and mind you, on a day-to-day basis, a lot of people are actually consuming fluoride because of the toothpaste, right? That little bit of toothpaste that's getting, mind you, on the back of the toothpaste label, it actually gives you the warning saying, do not consume this. If you consume this, call the poison hotline. And that is because, family, they're putting fluoride in the toothpaste, right? So they know that if you swallowed fluoride, right, what's the difference between you swallowing it from the toothpaste and you all of a sudden now, if you drink it, right, they're allowed to put that in our drinking water, so make it make sense. All right, so this is some freshly distilled water. We're going to see what this one here is going to be coming up with today. Hopefully, we want it to be measuring, as close as we can to zero. All right, so let's see if you can see that there. All right, I'll hold it up to the screen. You might not be able to see it there. All right, so I'm going to hold that right now. So what you can do is got a button here that you can hold it. All right, so let's check this out. All right, what's the reading there say? 0.01 parts per million. Okay, so I am very satisfied with that. Okay, so if I'm going to be drinking this now, we can rest assured that we're getting as close to pure H2O as we can. So very satisfied with that result, right? 0.01. Now the thing is with these TDS meters, and TDS basically stands for total dissolved solids, right? The thing about these meters is it's not going to give us what's inside of the water, right? What it's going to give us is it's going to give us how many parts per million are inside the water. So it's not going to tell us that there's fluoride in the water. It's not going to tell us what contaminants are inside the water, just how many of those contaminants are inside the water. So we got our next one here, right, which is the rainwater. Okay, so let's test the rainwater here, just a glass of rainwater. And we need to shake off, you want to use a tissue or you just want to shake off the water left over from the distilled water. Okay, so now we're going to test the rainwater. Okay, so we'll hold it there for 10-15 seconds. Right, so I know that you can't see that right now. There we go. Okay, so that's good enough. Right, we're going to hold that, press the hold button. And brothers and sisters, honestly, anybody can get themselves a TDS meter. This is a new one that I bought. because mine I've had for years and years, you know, and basically what happens over time is it might start getting inaccurate, you know, the longer you use it. And like I said, I've had that TDS meter for at least, you know, over 3 years. So I got this for $7 off of eBay, right? $7. So anyone can get themselves a TDS meter, right? Even if you can't afford it. But nonetheless, let's check out what it's reading for the rainwater. 68 parts per million. Okay, so we're dealing with basically 68 contaminants inside of the rainwater. You know, so hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, they could rest assured that the majority of that rainwater, you know, would be clean. And so a couple of weeks ago, I started having problems with my old distiller. And I'm going to show you that here today because I never cleaned it out. And, you know, it's going to blow your mind, you know, to see how damaged that old distiller is. But basically last week, you know, I bought a new distiller and I was I just ran it once. I pulled out the lid, right? And I was completely shocked. I'll put it up on screen here now to find how much graphene was inside of the distiller, right? And this was not after 2 or 3 goes, right? This was simply after 1 go. And so, yeah, a quick thing I forgot to mention, if anybody doubts that that's actually graphene, a couple of weeks ago, I took, you know, just did a sample. I took some rainwater out of the tank and I actually just filled up a regular cup with that. And I saw some black specks inside of that cup. So what I did is I got a magnet and sure enough, right, I put the magnet, attracted the magnet onto the cup, and wherever my magnet was going, that little black speck, I started to follow the course of that magnet. So gone are the days where rainwater, you know, is safe to drink. You know, so let me know your thoughts on that. You know, is this something that you've also stumbled across? But nonetheless, you know, the final glass of water I have here, right, we're going to be checking this one out. This is the mains water. All right, so we'll give our TDS meter another shake. Make sure that's clean. So let's see here what we can find for the mains. You know, is this water going to be less than the rainwater? You know, is this going to be safer than the rainwater? Oh dear. Oh dear. All right, so let's hold that. It's been about 10-15 seconds. $269 parts per million. So to the people out there drinking mains water, right, government ran facilities, right, the government is meant to be taking care of their citizens, right, giving them clean, fresh water to drink. Okay, so to be fair, we don't know what's inside, you know, all of the contaminants in there, right? There could be some minerals in here, okay, and that could be, you know, obviously the reason why it's so high. But you see, I've done a little bit of homework before I made this video, and I, you know, went on their website and I saw that they are adding fluoride, chlorine, you know, to the water, not to mention the nanotechnology that's being sprayed in the air, right, that goes, you know, inside of the water, right? So 269 here, right? This is why you want to be avoiding the mains, okay? So basically, you know, if you have something called reverse osmosis, right? If you don't drink distilled water, yet you have a reverse osmosis system, that is also another great way to get, you know, that water as pure as you can, right? Because reverse osmosis, it's a different method to distilled, but it still gets the water as pure as it can be. Right, so 2 different methods. It's different to distilled. Distilled might taste different, but so long as it's getting run through a reverse osmosis system, and you can always check it. with a TDS meter, right? So I personally don't use reverse osmosis. I always recommend people to drink distilled. And if you're somebody that lives in Australia, here in Australia, we have, being sold at, even the mainstream supermarkets like Coles, Woolworths, they sell a brand of water which is called Pure AU. Now, Pure AU water is the cleanest water you can probably buy on the market, right? So you will drop a TDS meter in there, right? I done it a couple of weeks ago when I had some here, and it was reading zero parts per million. Now, this is pure distilled water, okay? So if you can afford to buy that every week, Pure AU water here in Australia, and for anybody at, in America or around Europe, anywhere across the world, you want to be making sure that that distilled water is what they're selling you. So I know for myself, I've tested it myself. I can tell you that this brand of water here in Australia, Pure AU, is a great alternative, right? So RO water is still good to drink. However, I just recommend distilled water. So don't panic if you have reverse osmosis. Test it. See what it's, coming up as. If that's close to as zero as it can be. Because it's very, very important to make sure, that we're drinking, crystal clear pure H2O, right? If you want to add minerals to it, right? If you add minerals to your lifestyle, it doesn't necessarily have to be with the water. Right, that is just a Trojan horse for them to take the water and manipulate the ingredients of the water, okay? So that's what we, have to all just keep in mind. Now, before we wrap this video up, I have with me my distiller here that I've had for, there was going to come a time and day where I was going to show people what was being done to my distiller, right? And so that time and day, brothers and sisters, has come. I'm not sure how this is going to turn out, but right, so I've just made a mess on my desk here, but I'm going to have to just show you on screen, right? Check out the insides of that, and it is completely destroyed. And so the inside of this distiller is metal, right? So you think, if the inside of this distiller is metal, then what is this possibly doing to my insides? Right, my brain, my ability to function. Right, what is this water doing to my insides? If this is completely corroding, right, and destroying the metal inside of this water distiller, and that is coming from all the contaminants, all the chemicals inside of the water. So it's very, very crucial and important to remember that the water we drink has an effect on our health, right? Is the water we're drinking, ask yourself these questions, but is the water we're drinking contaminated with nanotechnology? Is the water that we're drinking contaminated with graphene, right? Smart dust. Because we know the smart dust is being sprayed in the air, it's being put in the food like we always talk about. Right, so is the water that we're drinking, as close to 0 parts per million? Okay, so if it's higher than that, right, if we're looking at mains water, and mains water is basically, 269 parts per million, right? They say they want to, put minerals inside of our drinking water, right? So therefore, your drinking water is safe. Right, but we know that that's just a Trojan horse. That's just a smokescreen to manipulate our drinking water. So I pray that this video, can, just help open your eyes out there, make you realize that the water we drink, it's so important to remember that the water that we drink, right, has an effect on our mental health. The water that we drink has an effect on our body overall, and these two things work synergistically with our spirit man, right? Our spirit man is attached to our body. So everything works in tandem with each other. That's why we need to respect our bodies and feed our bodies the correct water. So I love you all. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you in the next video.